Good morning. We have a busy schedule today. We're going to start with looking at the Counter-Reformation, which was, of course, directed by the Roman popes against the onslaught of Protestantism. And of course, what I just showed you was the capital, the citadel of the Roman Catholic Church, as it was reconstructed by the popes of the 16th and 17th century. And that's how we're going to begin. We're going to discuss the Counter-Reformation. But then we're going to do two review questions. And finally, I'm going to turn now away from Europe, and we're going to look at the Ottoman Empire, Islam and the Ottoman Empire. We're going to begin to discuss the Muslim world, and then, of course, onwards to India and China and ultimately Africa, and back eventually toward the end of these lectures to Europe. So let me begin by asking you whether you have any questions about what we've been discussing and your assignment. Like, you have this paper coming up on March 4th. So do you have any questions? Very good. Again, this second assignment is a key assignment because it will be your attempt to sort of write this one good thing that I'm looking for at the end of the class. I explained two or three lectures ago how to construct the essay in terms of 5 main points, an introduction and a conclusion. And you use the material that you assembled in the first assignment, and you put it together as an essay. The essay is corrected, and then the last stage is your attempt to sort of perfect the essay with the help of the corrections. And so that's the one good thing that we're really looking for. And if you do that, I think you'll be literate. You can actually write a university level essay, and you can do it in this class, and you can do it for all your other profs. And so this is what I hope to accomplish. So having said all that, I want to now begin with the Counter-Reformation. Find my place. Okay, the Counter-Reformation. So we saw that Protestantism took hold in Northern Europe. Essentially, by the middle of the 16th century, all of Northern Europe, the countries of Northern Europe, had seceded from the Catholic Church, or were on the way to doing so, and they had become what we call Lutheran, or also now Calvinist. The two main theologies were those of Protestant theologies were those of Luther and Calvin. And this, of course, was a huge blow to the unity of Europe and to, of course, the power of the Catholic Church. And we could say that certainly it was not prepared for this event. We saw that the humanists had pointed out the corruption, the power seeking of Rome, the superstitious practices which characterized the Roman Catholic practice. And this secession of the Protestants was a deep wound to the church and to the papacy. However, starting about the 1530s, the Roman Catholic Church began to make a comeback. And this we call the Counter-Reformation, or the Catholic Counter-Reformation. And one ingredient of that certainly was what had happened in Latin America, which I've described. With the help of the Spanish and the Portuguese monarchies, all of Latin America had been, by conviction and more usually by force, the indigenous people had been converted to Roman Catholicism. And Latin America then became a new frontier for the Roman Catholic Church. So they lost Northern Europe, but they gained Latin America. That's what we can say. That's the first element of the counter. The second element is that the popes decided in 1545 to call an assembly of all the bishops and principal authorities of the Catholic Church. And in a northern Italian city, close to the Alps mountain range, at Trent, in northern Italy, they called a church council made up of all the authorities of the Roman Catholic Church in 1545. And this council went on for almost 20 years, with, of course, breaks. Here you see here I've put Council of Trent, 1543, sorry, to 64. Now, this council met under the direct authority of the popes. And the first thing that the council did was to affirm that the pope was the head of the church. It was something that Luther and Calvin, of course, denied. So the first principle of the Council of Trent was to reaffirm the authority of the papacy. The second principle of the Council of Trent was to affirm the indispensable and distinctive role of the priests as intermediaries between human beings and God. Now, you remember that Luther had said he affirmed the idea of the priesthood of all believers. That is to say, anybody who, based on the gospel, believed in the saving power of Jesus Christ was indeed a priest. Whereas the Roman Catholic Church now said, no, that's not true. It's only through the church. It's only through the priest. It's only through the Mass and the works of the church that one could basically ensure one's salvation. So the popes, the Council of Trent affirms the authority of the popes, and it affirms the authority of the Roman Catholic priesthood. Does anybody have any questions about what I've said? Okay. And then, backing that up, while the Council of Trent is going on, the popes begin to rebuild Rome. Rome was a medieval city, and in fact, it had recently been under military attack and siege. Well, the popes now began to rebuild Rome as a great capital city. And you saw at the beginning of this class, I showed that film of St. Peter's Basilica, which was at the heart, it still is at the heart of Rome. They reconstructed and built all sorts of new churches in the city. They rebuilt the municipal infrastructure, huge avenues and streets connecting all of the main churches in the city and palaces in the city. In fact, they turned Rome into the first capital city of Europe. All the other sort of capitals in Paris and in Spain were still medieval cities, but the popes were they turned Rome into this grand capital city. To back up the religious authority, they affirmed the power of the papacy, the political power. And in order to do this, they consolidated their control over central Italy. I think I mentioned earlier lectures that the popes created this papal state, the whole of central Italy, which is extremely rich. All of the cities, the towns, the rich agriculture was basically under the authority of the Pope, just as England was under the authority of the King of England, or France was under the authority of the King of France. The popes were kings or monarchs at the same time as they were religious leaders. Well, control over the papal state gave them the revenues to rebuild Rome in the way I've described. So the reaffirmation of the spiritual authority of the Pope or the Council of Trent, and then the building up of Rome and the papal state as the material basis of the papacy. And of course, I've mentioned the conquest of Latin America. In order to basically ensure that this heresy that had developed in Northern Europe would not affect Italy and the rest of Europe, which had remained Catholic, that is to say, southern Germany and Italy and Austria, and we can include Poland and Hungary, of course, Spain. The popes, using the model of the Spanish Inquisition, introduced the Roman Inquisition. That is to say, as special courts to deal with heretics. And they were very busy in the 16th and 17th century, persecuting anybody who showed signs of Protestant heresy. Furthermore, they issued a special list of prohibited books. Of course, the Protestant heresy spread through the book, through the Gospels. And the Roman popes issued a special index, was called the Roman Index of Prohibited Books, a list of all of the books that were infected by heresy. Ultimately, it totaled thousands of books that any good Roman Catholic was prohibited from reading. And of course, one of the books that was prohibited was, of course, Machiavelli's Prince. But all the new books, which an interested sort of young scholar might be interested in reading, were prohibited by Rome. So, to repeat, conquest of Latin America, Council of Trent, rebuilding Rome and the papal state, the Inquisition and the Index. Finally, we note that the popes created new religious orders to fight heretics, to purify the church, to stimulate a renewed sense of religiosity and to spread the Catholic faith once again in Europe, but indeed throughout the world. So new religious orders, but particularly religious orders which were directed towards missionizing, that is to say, winning new converts to the Catholic faith. These are the famous missions. And the most important of these missions were the Jesuits, who were founded by a Spanish a zealot by the name of Ignatius Loyola, the Jesuits under Loyola. Again, I ask, do you have any questions? Okay, let me continue with the Jesuits. Now, the Jesuits were missionaries, and they did outstanding, many of them were sent to Latin America to convert the indigenous, or they were sent to Asia to convert the Chinese and the Japanese, the South Asians and the Indonesians to the Catholic faith. The most important of these missionaries in terms of Asia was a man by the name of Francis Xavier. And indeed, we have a town west of Manitoba, west of Winnipeg, called St. Francis Xavier, named after this Jesuit. So we have Loyola, who's the founder. We have Francis Xavier, who another Jesuit, who brings the Roman Catholic religion to Asia. And the Jesuits, so they specialized in this missionary work, but they also set up schools all over Catholic Europe, that is, say, in Italy and Spain, in Austria and Poland and what have you, where not everybody could go to one of these schools. These were schools, they were high schools, and they trained members of the nobility and the middle class in humanist studies. Get that, humanist studies, that is to say, I spoke about humanism, the recovery of the ancient world. The curriculum was largely the study of the ancient classics, but also the basic tenets of the Catholic Church were inculcated into these noblemen and to these members of the middle class in Southern Europe and in Central Europe. And so this was, these were some of the activities of the Jesuits. And then there was another order, which was named after its founder, an individual by the name of Vincent de Paul, the so-called Paulinian order. And the Paulinians were different than the Jesuits. The Jesuits concentrated on, as these missions, they concentrated on what we can call the educated elites, noblemen, and members of the bourgeoisie, of the middle class. But the Paulinians specialized in working with the poor. And they taught the poor the basic elements of the Catholic religion, but they also gave them food and clothing, charity, in other words. And this was an important feature of this Counter-Reformation activity, because, to put it frankly, the Protestants essentially ignored the poor people. The Protestants basically said poverty was your own fault. You weren't working hard enough. That was why you were poor, and it was a sign that God didn't like you. whereas the Catholic Church took another attitude and basically said that the poor also have souls and deserve to be saved. And so the Roman Church of the Counter-Reformation did help poor people as a good work, as essentially a good work. The wealthy had to help the poor. And this certainly because there were more and more poor people. Capitalism was creating poverty. At the same time, people lost their land, became workers, or they became beggars, and they needed help. And so the Roman Catholic Church, they got a leg up. They got a certain stimulus by helping poor people. That's an important aspect of things. And finally, we should say that the Protestants, of course, we saw the Protestants got the support of the kings, the princes, the wealthy, aspiring middle class in Northern Europe. And if you did not support the Protestant Church, if you remained a Catholic or otherwise, or you were indifferent, the Protestants turned to the political authorities in order to ensure your obedience. So what I'm saying is the Protestants invoked the power of government against anybody who was deviant. Well, the Catholic Church did the same thing. In Southern and Eastern Europe, they got the support of the kings, of the princes, of the aristocracies, in order to put down Protestants and all other heretics. So both the Protestant Reformation and the Counter-Reformation freely used persecution by the political authorities. The arm of the state was used in order to ensure and enforce religious conformity. And indeed, as we'll see much later, violence broke out between Protestants and Catholics. And basically, religion became a political issue in the latter part of the 16th and 17th century, period of the religious wars. But we're not dealing with that now. We're turning away. We're moving towards a discussion of Islam and the Ottoman Empire. But before I do that, I want to ask you again, do you have any questions about the Counter-Reformation? Very good. So I'm going to turn away from that, and I'm going to basically now do two review questions, which actually sum up a lot of what I've been saying this morning. Okay, last time, I think we did question 6. I want to now do question 7, and I want to do the two successive questions. Namely, Luther hatched the egg laid by Erasmus. Explain. And the next question is, the challenge of the Reformation was met by the Catholic Counter-Reformation, what we just discussed. So to take up the first question, Luther hatched the egg laid by Erasmus. Now, what the hell did I mean by this question? Well, this was said at the time. People said that Erasmus laid the groundwork for Luther. They accused Erasmus of basically preparing the way for Luther. And so in order to answer this question, I think the basic line one has to use in answering this question was, indeed, there is a connection between Erasmus and Luther. but they're not the same. And let's discuss this. First of all, in order to answer this question, you want to tell me who Erasmus was. He was a Dutch monk. He was brilliant, and he, just like the humanists in Southern Europe, he became interested in studying classical antiquity, the Romans and the Greeks. He studied the works of the great philosophers and poets and historians of the Greeks and the Romans. But at the same time, he began to criticize the church. And in a series of pamphlets, he wrote in a very funny way and a very sarcastic way about the corruption in the church, the superstition in the church, the immorality in the church, the materialism of the church, the power hunger of the popes. All of this came under criticism. Now, the Italian humanists had done much the same thing, but Erasmus was outstanding in the way he did this. He did this even in a humorous way. And remember, the printed word, the book, the pamphlet were new. Many people began to buy these books. They became bestsellers. Then, as time went on, Erasmus came to the conclusion that, as a matter of fact, the Bible was the key to reforming the church. It wasn't enough to criticize. One had to get at how to reform the church. Well, Erasmus said the key to sort of reforming the church is to go back to the original text of the early Christian church. And of course, that's the Bible, especially the New Testament. So for many years, he worked and finally published what we call a critical edition, a Greek and Latin edition of the New Testament. So, a monumental work of scholarship. You can find a copy in Defoe Library if you want to look at it. Then, of course, he continued to publish pamphlets, and he explained that, yes, if you look into the New Testament, there you will find the essence of what Christianity is about. And he called this essence the philosophy of Christ. So what was this philosophy? It was the Sermon on the Mount. It was basically being good to your neighbor and offering charity to the poor. This was the essence of Christianity for Erasmus, not all the materialism, the superstitious works of the church, etc. And finally, I would say that Erasmus, although he issued this reform program, basically did not want revolution. He was a moderate man, and what he was calling for was for the popes and the bishops to undertake this reform. So it was reform, not revolution. So that's Erasmus. On the contrary, Luther revolutionized. Luther was a revolutionary. He revolutionized the program of Erasmus. That's the difference. Yes, Erasmus prepares the way for Luther, but the difference is Erasmus is a reformer, not a revolutionary. And in what sense is Luther a revolutionary? In the first sense, that Erasmus believed in reform within the Catholic Church, whereas Luther said, never mind the church, the Bible, the scriptures, and especially the New Testament, is the basis of the church. And since we have the text of the Bible, we don't need the church. When we look at the Bible, what we find is that it's not a question of the works That is to say, all of the practices, the seven sacraments, the worship of the saints, the worship of Mary, the pilgrimages, the lighting of candles, the saying of rosaries, these were, even charity is not the basis of salvation. The New Testament teaches us, especially St. Paul's epistle, that faith and faith alone, if you have faith in the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross, you will be saved. So the Bible and the Bible alone, faith alone saves. And if you look to the Bible and you look to faith alone for your salvation, you are indeed a priest. You belong to the priesthood of all believers. So the three key doctrines of Luther are the Bible and the Bible alone is the basis of Christianity. Secondly, faith alone saves you. You don't need the works of the church. And thirdly, the priesthood of all believers. And that's the
Professor,
difference. Yes.
could you please repeat the three doctrines?
Yes. The Bible and the Bible alone is a source of authority. Secondly, it's salvation through faith rather than works. So the Bible and the Bible alone, faith rather than works. And finally, the priesthood of all believers. All those who adhere to the Bible as a source of authority and faith alone is saving are priests. And there is a priesthood of all believers rather than the priests of the Catholic Church. You don't have to use their works in order to be saved. In order for God to smile on you, you don't need the church.
Oh, I see. So you just have to believe, and then you're a priest
Yes, they're all priests. If you there's no fundamental sort of separation between a special priesthood and the rest of humanity. All of humanity can be priests if they accept the Bible and faith alone. You see? So it undercuts the whole basis of the Roman Catholic faith.
Right. So then the church isn't needed in that scenario.
That's right. That's right.
Okay. Got it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. So is that, anybody want any further clarification? Okay. So the next, just a second. The challenge of the Reformation was met by the Catholic Counter-Reformation. Well, in answering this question, I think what you want to do basically, just a second. Is basically repeat what I said about Luther. You say, okay, Luther created this revolution based on these three key ideas. Then you might want to mention, you should mention Calvin, because why was he important? Because he published this book called The Christian Institutes, which basically gave an organized account of what Protestantism was all about. Just as the Council of Trent outlined, here are the key doctrines of Catholic teaching. Calvin did the same thing with his Christian Institutes in this book. And secondly, he gave Protestantism an organizational structure, which Luther never really did. He gave it a kind of sort of independent sort of organization, which gave it a sort of both religious strength, but also political strength. Calvin did so. So organizational strength and theological or religious strength. And finally, he imposed first at Geneva, but everywhere where Calvinism imposed itself, he imposed what we call Puritanism, or what some have called the Protestant ethic, which was based on the need for basically family and work discipline as the basis of life, and which many scholars have seen as related to basically early capitalism. The early capitalists, many of them became Calvinists. And so this link has been made between Calvinist religion, Puritanism, the work discipline, the strict family life, and the accumulation of capital. And you see that it was especially in Switzerland, in Holland, in Scotland, and in England, where capitalism, those became the centers of capitalism, and they essentially converted to the Calvinist religion. So this link between Calvinism and Protestant. So Luther's ideas and then Calvin's sort of development of Protestant. And then in order to sort of answer the second part, the Counter-Reformation, well, I outlined earlier in the lecture the essential elements of the Counter-Reformation: the conquest of Latin America, the Council of Trent, the spiritual, the political and material reconstruction of Rome and of the Papal State, the Council of Trent, the missions, the Index, and the Inquisition. That's the answer to the second part of this question. Does anybody have any questions about what I've said?
So
I'm very I'm very glad that you're sort of asking, because
yeah.
yes,
So
please.
Aramis was
Erasmus.
he was willing to make reform within the church and keep the structure of it.
Yes.
However, Luther came along later and he wanted to revolutionize and get rid of the church.
Yes.
And he was basing it on the three
Principles.
doctrines. And then Calvin was the third one in the chain, and he further organized Luther's doctrines into like a more defined set of religions.
And then he also this link between this Puritanism. His headquarters was Geneva, and Geneva was not a fun place. You know, you had Geneva was like Morden or Winkler. Okay, that's what I'm basically saying here. You know, family and work. Do you understand?
So he was just basing it off of like, just that's like, so Calvin's own version of it was focused around family and work.
That's right.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Okay. Just a second now. I want to find the last. We're turning now away from Europe. We spent a lot of time in Europe. I'm just looking for my text. Just a second. Yeah, here it is. Okay. Spent a lot of time on Europe now. I want to start looking elsewhere. And what we're doing is I'm trying to bring up a map here. Just give me a minute. Yeah, here we are. We're looking at the Ottoman Empire now. We're looking at the beginning of the 16th century. And what we see is, of course, what we've been looking at is this, Europe. But to the east and south, you see in green here, this colossal Islamic empire is just coming into being.
Professor,
Simultaneous, yes.
I don't think we can see anything.
Okay, just a second. Thank you so much for preventing me from making myself into a complete fool. Here we have it. So here we see, you can see the map now, right?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay. So here you see Western Europe, etc. But here at the beginning of the 16th century, you see the emergence of this colossal Islamic empire, the Ottoman Empire. And look, it extends all the way almost to the gates of Vienna in Central Europe. The Ottomans took over the whole of the Balkans. And actually in 1529, they tried to conquer the city of Vienna. Charles V had to hustle from Spain in order to try and prevent the Ottomans from actually taking Vienna. And so this was the Christians in Western Europe. This was their greatest nightmare because the Muslims had been at war with the Europeans right through the Middle Ages, right? So look, the Muslims are reviving. And of course, they have taken over the whole of North Africa. And so they can, using ships, they can raid the shipping of the Europeans all along the northern coast of the Mediterranean. They can block the trade with Asia. The merchants of Italy, we saw, were blocked temporarily, of course, because the Muslims, the Ottoman Empire came to control the whole of the Middle East, with the exception of Persia. And so we have to seriously consider the Ottoman Empire, and it was to remain a factor right until, I guess, the 18th and 19th centuries. The Ottoman Empire was still a factor in European politics. So it's important. Now, the first thing I would say, well, first of all, the extent of this entity is enormous, far larger than any European state, both in population and geography. It's much larger. I'd say that Western Europe had 70 to 80 million people in the 16th century, whereas I think the population of the Ottoman Empire would be closer to 100 million people. And another feature of it was the fact that the ruler, who lived, of course, in Istanbul, which had previously been known as Constantinople, right here, Istanbul, that he was both the religious head and the political head of the Ottoman Empire. He was both he was what was known as the Sultan, who was both the religious and the political leader of this entity. And of course, the religion, which was the, the, the religion which he controlled was, of course, Islam, the Islamic religion, but it was a certain variant of Islam. There were basically Islam was divided into Shias and Sunni. We'll get into that in a while. This was Sunni Islam, and the difference I'll explain subsequently. Now, what I want to talk about for the rest of the hour is it's problematic that this studying from the point of view of the West, studying Islam is problematic, and we are familiar with. I mean, all of this in the last years. There's been this incredible tension between Europeans, especially Americans, and the Middle East, and those who profess the Islamic religion. Arab people have been subject to a lot of persecution in the West. I don't have to explain this. I think you understand the background to what I'm saying. And part of the reason for this is that it doesn't explain everything, but is that one has to understand that the West, that is to say Western Europe and North America, we saw that in Europe, religion was very important. That at the beginning, in 1500 still, anybody who was a West European had to be a Roman Catholic. And you had to be at least a Christian in order to basically survive. If you unfortunately were a Muslim or a Jew, well, watch out. Or maybe even a private atheist like Machiavelli. You had to watch out. And so religion and the state were closely bound up in Western Europe right through the early modern period that we're talking about. But then in 1776 and then in 1789, there were two revolutions. The first of them occurred in what became the United States of America in 1776, and then in France in 1789. And one of the basic principles of these two revolutions was the separation of church and state. In other words, religion became a private matter, and the state took no position. It did not enforce religious conformity. It separated state and church. And what we can say is that from that point on, a process of secularization occurred. Religion became less and less important in the West, whereas that did not happen in the Middle East, in the Near East. Religion remained important. In fact, it became in some ways more important. And so this basic difference in terms of the evolution of the Middle East, in terms of people's adherence to religion, there's a separation that occurred, which basically affected people's attitudes. Now, what was the reason for this? Why did this happen? Well, one thing I would say is that you should understand that Islam is a culture as well as a religion. It's deeply ingrained in the cultures of the people of the Middle East. It's a way of living. It's a certain practice of a sort of family life, of social life, of the relations between men and women and children, even food. It's a deeply ingrained. Islam is deeply ingrained as a culture. But secondly, and here I'll end, the fact is that the West, as it gained power, became increasingly expansive overseas. In fact, it began to practice colonialism and imperialism from the 18th century onwards. Colonialism, Western colonialism and imperialism. And of course, that affected Africa, it affected Asia, it affected Latin America, but it also affected the Middle East. And one of the ways the people of the Middle East defended themselves and continue to defend themselves is by this strict adherence to Islam. And I'll elaborate that in the next class. Thank you very much.
Professor,
Yes,
so maybe I missed it, but earlier you said there was Sunni Islam and there was something else as well. There was a second type?
yes, Shia Islam. But I'm going to talk about that in a little while. So I
Oh, I see.
said
This is I see. I just
Sunni
I thought I
Islam.
missed it.
Okay.